All right, so this is a series of lectures on Jesus as a historical figure, and this is lecture number 4, called Jesus' Social World. So in order to understand a person of history, we have to understand the context in which they lived, right? And so we want to build that context for Jesus. And the first and most important thing that we can say about Jesus' social context is that Jesus was Jewish. And, you know, that seems like a sort of obvious thing, but it is also really, it's really crazy how often Jesus' Jewishness is sort of swept aside in telling stories about Jesus. That people tend to think of Jesus as mostly a Christian or a proto-Christian, and his Jewishness is just sort of, it's a fact that people know, but it's like unimportant in how they tell the story of Jesus. And that really hampers the way we understand Jesus, because Jesus was really Jewish, very fully Jewish, and had no, Jesus had no intention of building a religion. Jesus had no thought of anything like what we call Christianity. So Jesus dressed like a Jew. He ate kosher. He followed the law. Even we know about disputes that Jesus has throughout the Gospels. He has disputes with Pharisees about Sabbath and various laws. But these are never disputes about whether or not one should follow the law. They're about how to implement following the law. They're always intra-Jewish disputes about how exactly to follow the law. We know that Jesus celebrated Jewish holidays, right? He made sacrifices in the temple, and he, in fact, expected his followers to continue to make sacrifices in the temple. There's a saying in Matthew where Jesus says to his disciples, when you're going to make a sacrifice in the temple, and you realize that you have a fight with your brother, is what he calls it, but he means, someone, one of your friends, someone that you're close with, first go and fix that problem with your friend, and then go to the temple to make your sacrifice. In other words, you don't want to, part of having a clean conscience when you go before the throne of God is about your relationships to other people. But the interesting thing here is that, right, Jesus he expects for his disciples to continue to make sacrifices even after he's gone. He wants them to continue their Jewish faith and life. So Jesus is Jewish. He has no idea of sort of reforming Judaism or starting a new religion. That is not in his plans. And so the primary way for Jewish people, particularly in Jesus' day, to understand themselves and their relationship to God and to the world is through this idea of covenant. And the idea is that God makes a covenant, a partnership, a relationship with an agreement or a deal, a bargain with this people, the people of Israel, with Abraham's family. And they have a job to do. Their job is through the temple and the ritual and sacrifice that happens in the temple, that they make the presence of God safe and available to the world. That is the unique calling and vocation of the Jewish people, that they are to be a blessing for all the world by making the presence of God available in the world through their unique rituals in the temple. In return, God will give to them land on which to have the temple, a people, a whole society, which will make possible the running of this particular vocation, a king to protect the land and to protect the society, right? And so God will provide these things for them, and they will in turn conduct proper worship in the temple, which will make God available in the world, make the presence of God available in the world. There's a problem with this covenant. And that problem, at least during the lifetime of Jesus, is that in the year 63 before the Common Era, the Roman Empire annexed Palestine, took over the land. So the Jewish people no longer had control of their own land. To the extent that they had a king, it was a fake king, a paper king, what's often called a client king, because Rome would set up a king in a place that they had occupied, who would be a native person, but they would serve at the pleasure of Rome. And the temple, because of the relationship of the temple authorities to this client king and to the Roman government, many Jews believe was defiled and no longer serving its proper purpose. Jesus is among them. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The historian Marcus Borg, when he describes sort of the social context of Jesus, he describes it as a tributary commercial agricultural domination system. That's a mouthful. So I'll say it again, and then we'll talk about each of the pieces of it. Is a tributary commercial agricultural domination system. So let me say what that means. Let's start first with the idea of a domination system. So in Jesus' day in Palestine, about 1% of the population were wealthy, very exorbitantly wealthy, elite ruling class, people who in some way conducted the governance of the region. Another maybe 1 to 2% of the population, so totaling 2 or 3% of the population, were also relatively wealthy and worked in the service of in some sense, of this governing class. The rest, the vast majority, 97 or 98% of the population, lived in abject poverty. They were peasants. And they were predominantly, at least to begin, agricultural peasants, right? Because this is an agricultural domination system. The peasant class, which was the vast majority, could be further stratified into sort of agrarian peasants, farmers, and then below them would be tenant farmers or sharecroppers, people who didn't have their own land but farmed for someone else, either for a share of the crop or for a wage. Day laborers, people who didn't even have steady work as tenant farmers but were just brought in to the service of a farm or someone else who might need something. So these are below sort of landowning agrarians. And then there were a class of people who were known as the unclean, people with various skin diseases or blood diseases, people who were completely separated from society, completely had to pull themselves away, be sort of brought up in camps filled with only other unclean people. So this is a domination system. It is a top-down, very small minority of people at the top who rule over a large group of people who are oppressed, people who have no power in society, no say in how their lives will go. The rule is often done by force, by violence, and this domination system is not unique to Jesus' world. This is, in fact, the normalcy of society in much of the ancient world. A hierarchical, top-down, forceful, oppressive ruling class who rules over the majority of the population. It's a domination system, and it's the way society works very often in the ancient world. Now, we've said that this is an agricultural domination system. It's also a tributary agricultural domination system. So what do we mean by tributary? So I said that Rome was the Roman Empire occupied this territory at the time of Jesus. Rome ruled a territory differently from the Greek Empire, for instance. Many of us know about the Greek process called Hellenization. And that is basically that when the Greeks took over a territory, the Greeks had once occupied this territory some 100 years or so before the Romans did. And when the Greeks occupied a territory, their interest was to spread Greek culture across the globe. And so when they came, they would tear down or reestablish temples of the native religion in that space, and they would put up temples to Greek gods, or they would put statues to Greek gods in the existing temples. They would have all children attend Greek schools where they would learn to speak and write in Greek. This, by the way, is why the New Testament is written in Greek and not in Aramaic, because the world that Jesus lived in had 100 years prior been occupied by the Greek Empire, and that meant that the education, the people who were highly educated, who were writing books and things, learned to speak and to write in Greek. And so they would put up Greek, they would have Greek baths and Greek sports and Greek theaters and Greek, all kinds of things of Greek culture were put in place. The Romans did not care about this sort of thing. The Romans were not interested in making anyone Roman. The Romans were instead interested in exactly two things. They wanted peace in their territories, and peace meaning no revolt. So they didn't really care. You were perfectly fine to rule by violence as long as you kept anyone from fomenting revolt. And they wanted taxes. So the Romans were eager only to collect taxes from their territories. And so the Romans would generally set up native collaborators in their territories. So they would, as I said, make a client king. They would take a native person, make them king over the territory. And as long as that client king would collect taxes and squash any rebellion that popped up, they served at the pleasure of Rome. They were perfectly happy to stay in place. And so peace and tribute, these are the two things that the Romans required. Now, who do you think paid that tribute? Was it paid by the wealthy elite ruling class? Or were those tax monies passed on to the peasants? Well, of course, they're passed down to the peasants. The taxes were extracted from the peasants as wealth grew and grew at the top of society, as it always does. The native collaborator, the client king that we've already mentioned, we've already met in this series of lectures, is a person named Herod the Great. He was called the Great not because he was a good guy. He was, in fact, quite a nasty fellow. But he's known to history as Herod the Great because he was incredibly good at extracting wealth from his peasant classes in order to do massive building projects. He built the temple in Jerusalem, which is really one of the wonders of the ancient world, an incredible, beautiful building project. It was later destroyed, as we've already mentioned, by the Romans in 70 CE, but it was there all through the life of Jesus. And Herod the Great was also a great proponent of commercial farming. This is one of the ways that he extracted a lot of wealth from the peasant classes and funneled it up to the top. So we've talked about it's a tributary agricultural domination system, and under Herod the Great, it became a tributary commercial agricultural domination system. And so think about what happens when you move a society from small subsistence farms to commercial farming, where you're no longer farming on your land all the things that you and your family and your extended family need for everyday life. Instead, you have a massive field where you're growing only olives, right? What that means is that the work becomes seasonal. It's great for creating more wealth in a society. It's great if you're at the top, right, where wealth is being funneled up, because you can produce lots and lots of more of a crop that you can then use for exports. But for the individual farmers, the work becomes seasonal. It also becomes very unstable because it's tied to if you have a bad crop because of the weather one particular year, it can totally sink your whole financial situation. And so because there's this lack of the diversification present in subsistence farming, it leads to, among the peasant classes, a lot of food insecurity, right? And so people begin to not know where their next meal is coming from, often. And this, of course, leads to debt. When families have their back against the wall and have no way to provide for their family because they're in these commercial farming situations, and a drought happens that causes their one crop to not do well this year, they don't have any way to provide for their family, they go into debt. People will give them loans, but put a lien on their land, let's say. The debt then leads to loss of land, very often, which leads people to be sharecroppers or tenant farmers, where they are farming not on their own land anymore, but they're farming on the land of some other large commercial farm, either for a wage or for a share of the product that they then have to take to market. Or they become day laborers, people who wait for work and are hired to do certain jobs because they don't have any land on which to provide for themselves. We know that Jesus' father, the person who raised Jesus, Joseph, is described as a tekton. It's often translated as carpenter in our Gospels, but tekton just means somebody who works with their hands to build things. Perhaps a stonemason or something like this. And in one of the Gospels, even Jesus is described as a tekton, which is likely. He probably took up his family business. This is pretty common. And so that means that Joseph, and for some part of his life at least, Jesus, was a day laborer. Someone who probably lost their land because of food insecurity, which led to debt because of this move toward commercial farming under the rule of Herod the Great. So think about what this means. There's a famous prayer that you all know that in at least the source that we call Q, that exists in Matthew and Luke, Jesus teaches his disciples to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us, the way that it appears in Luke, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then, of course, the prayer goes on. Jesus is talking about food security and debt. We in the modern West tend to think of these as metaphors for some sort of spiritual reality. Spiritual food and forgiveness of sins. That's how we often translate it. Forgive us our trespasses. But no, Jesus is talking about the reality of life on the ground in first century Palestine. His followers, when they pray, are praying for food and release from debt. These are the real political and economic realities of the people that Jesus is talking to. And these are the real prayers that they're praying. Well, after the death of Herod the Great, there's a lot of rioting and upheaval, and it leads Rome to actually breaking up the territory of Palestine into a tetrarchy, into 4 parts, and each of those 4 parts are given rulership by 3 of Herod's sons and his sister Salome. So 2 of these don't really come into play in our story. In the far north, that region is given to Herod's son Philip. And what is today known as the West Bank, the Palestinian West Bank, that small strip of land, essentially, is ruled by Herod's sister, Salome. The other 2 are more important for our story. So Galilee, which is the home of Jesus. It's the region in which the city of Nazareth is found, and the city of Capernaum, where Jesus later sets up his ministry, is ruled by Herod's son, Herod Antipas. This is the Herod of Jesus' adult life. So Herod the Great only appears in that nativity story in Matthew, but all of the rest of the mentions of Herod throughout the Gospels are in reference to this Herod Antipas. And finally, the region in the south of Syria and Judea are ruled first by Herod's son Archelaus. Archelaus does not please Rome. He is not good at keeping rebellion at bay, and so he is banished by Rome because, again, these client kings are only paper kings. They only serve at the pleasure of Rome. And he's replaced by the governor Quirinius, who we've already mentioned, who oversaw this census in 6 CE that shows up in Luke's nativity story. He is also punished for the rebellions that break out during this census, and he's banished. And ultimately, Rome decides that this territory of Judea and Samaria is just far too complicated to be ruled by a client king, to be ruled by a native rule. Rome thinks of this region, if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself, right? And so Rome decides that they will put in place a Roman governor in this one region. It's not their practice, it's not what they like to do, but in this case, this area is just far too volatile, so they'll put a Roman governor in place. The most famous of these Roman governors, and certainly the most important for our story, is the one who rules from the year 26 to 36 of the Common Era. His name is Pontius Pilate. We'll, of course, encounter him later in the story. Rome, in principle, even though they decided that this area is far too volatile to not have a real Roman governor, they in principle still like the idea of native rule. Everything sort of goes more smoothly as natives are in charge of their own land, Rome thinks. And so, along with these Roman governors who will rule over Judea and Samaria, the Romans have the temple authorities, the people who are running the temple, to rule alongside the governor, to help to be a native presence of governance in Judea. And so, but of course, Rome is not going to let anyone rule that they have not approved. And so beginning at the time when governors are put in place of this, beginning around 6 CE, you have the high priest, the person who is in charge of the temple, is appointed by Rome. And then, of course, all the other temple officials are hired by this high priest and vetted by the Roman government, by the Roman governor. And so you see what happens, right? This space where the covenant people, where their unique vocation lies, to be the place where the presence of God is made available to the world, where God's blessing to the world channels through the people of Israel in this space of the temple, it becomes the home, the pinnacle of the Roman domination system. Right? The very place where divine presence is supposed to be most uniquely felt and divine energy is supposed to flow out to the world, it becomes the place of collaboration with the powers of evil, with the powers of oppression and injustice. So what do you do with that? How is a Jew to respond to this? Well, it turns out there are four primary responses to this very disturbing political situation in first century Palestine. The Jewish historian Josephus describes these four different sort of what he calls the four philosophies, and they're four responses to this Roman occupation, and particularly the temple authorities' collaboration with the Roman occupation. So the first Jewish response is shows up in people who are called the Sadducees, and the Sadducees are essentially the temple authorities, and the people who work in and around the temple. They are collaborators with the Roman occupation. They say, look, yes, this maybe isn't the way that Torah describes how we ought to be functioning in the temple, but Rome comes with a lot of benefits. They make nice roads and aqueducts, and we get all kinds of good stuff. And so we should continue our worship in the temple and be in collaboration with this outside government. We should do it in such a way that we can grow and improve our facilities and have all kinds of benefits. And so the Sadducees collaborate with the government. We often talk in the United States about Christian nationalism, right? About religious traditions that want to have that get tangled up in political power, right? Where it's seen as a good thing to have political power so you can exert the will of your religious tradition on the rest of the nation. The Sadducees are like this. The Sadducees are collaborators with the government, and they think that the religious tradition and the government ought to be tied together and ought to go hand in hand so that they can have more of a say, and a broad say in sort of how society is run. So on the one side, you have the Sadducees. On the far opposite end from the Sadducees, you have the radicals, who Josephus calls just the fourth philosophy. He doesn't give them a name, but they're often known to history as the Zealots. Zealots are violent revolutionaries. They're people who want to overthrow the Roman government, right? Who want to oust the Romans out of Palestine. They want to reestablish native rule, the Davidic kingdom, and they want to cleanse the temple, right? And they think that to do so requires a military revolution. Somewhere between, on the far right, the Sadducees, and on the far left, the Zealots, you have the Essenes. The Essenes are a community who, like the Zealots, believe that the temple has been entirely corrupted by this collaboration between the Romans and the native temple authorities. But they respond to it not by seeking a violent overthrow of the Roman occupation, but they respond to it rather by withdrawing from the world, sort of a proto-monastic movement. We find the writings of the Essenes at the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. So they go into the desert and they live in caves, and they decide to, they reject the temple. They say that the temple is entirely corrupt, and if we're going to live out our Jewish faith, we have to do so in this new way, separate from all that has been corrupted. We have to hold ourselves pure for the day when God will make all things right. But we have to do this by staying away from the corrupted temple. The Pharisees is the final of these options. You hear a lot about the Pharisees in the Gospels. Jesus is always sort of in conflict. The Pharisees were by far the most popular of the four philosophies. They are not violent revolutionaries like the Zealots. They are not like the Essenes, going to pull away from society, but they are interested in purity, like the Essenes, but they want to not just make themselves more pure, they want to grow within society a culture of purity, right? And a culture of, in the midst of this sort of Gentile collaboration and this impurity within the temple, we want to, by following as carefully and as stringently as possible the Torah, we can create a society of purity. And so they become this sort of pressure group within society to make, you can think of them as sort of a moral majority, sort of trying to increase the purity culture of the society as a whole. And so where does Jesus fit into all of this ways of understanding his social context? It's hard to tell, right? Jesus is clearly not a Sadducee. He is, as we'll see later, a serious critic of the temple, right? And he ends up getting himself ultimately killed by first arrested by the temple police, by the people who are in the midst of this collaboration between the occupying Roman force and the temple authorities. And so he's not a Sadducee. You might think if he's opposed to the Roman occupation, maybe Jesus is a zealot. I mean, he does say things often that have led a few people, not many scholars, to talk about Jesus as a zealot. There's a very popular book that came out just a few years ago by a scholar named Reza Aslan called Zealot, and it presents this picture of Jesus as a violent revolutionary. But that doesn't seem to be the case. When Jesus is arrested, his followers are not rounded up and arrested with him, right? Which is what we would expect from a violent revolutionary. People don't seem to think Jesus is actually a threat in that way. We know that when people come to arrest him, he tells his disciples to put their swords away, not to resist in a violent way. He's presenting a kingdom of political vision, but it comes not in this kind of way of the Zealots. Well, he's not an Essene, right? Or otherwise he wouldn't be preaching anything at all. He would be, we would never have heard of him. He would be off in a cave somewhere, hiding away. So what does that leave? Is Jesus a Pharisee? Well, a couple of people have suggested this. Maybe Jesus is a Pharisee. But of course, Jesus, throughout the Gospels, has his most vigorous debates with the Pharisees, which, could lend itself to the argument that he is a Pharisee, because people often have the debates with the people that they're most familiar with. But Jesus seems to critique the Pharisees at the very point of their identity, the thing that they are about this sort of stringent and particular understanding of the law and following of the law in this kind of particular way to increase the purity of the culture. Jesus is always attacking that. So Jesus has this very odd relationship where he clearly is just as concerned as everybody else in society about this collaboration between the native temple authorities and the Roman occupation. This is his concern. It is what ends up getting him killed. And yet he doesn't seem to fit in any of our sort of standard categories of thinking about the way that people would respond to this. Jesus is doing something new and interesting in his social context. But that's the ground. This social context is the ground from which we have to understand Jesus. Okay, so now we know how it is that historians work with the sources that we have, the very complicated sources that we have, to build a picture of Jesus. We know about the social context in which this picture emerges. Now we can turn in our next several lectures to actually building a picture of who this person, Jesus of Nazareth, was.